Yes, hi, I'm Kingfisher. I'm also Ursula Vernon. Kingfisher is just when I'm not writing for children, which is a lot these days. Not that I don't like writing for children, but after a point, when your children's book author, all of the things your editor tells you you can't do start to compress in your chest into diamond, and eventually you're like, I'm gonna write a book where I do everything. It's gonna be horrible, and they will solve their problems with arson, and no one will stop me. Yes, for the record, very few children's book editors will let you solve the problems by very anyway, this is What Moves the Dead is a retelling of The Fall of the House of Usher, and I wrote it because I happened to reread Fall of the House of Usher and went, wow, this is both much shorter than I remembered, and also the narrator is completely useless. The narrator is just goes in, doesn't ask any questions, hangs out with Roderick Usher. Madeline walks by in the background. Roderick's like, yeah, it's my sister, she's gonna die, and narrator's like, cool. And then, spoiler alert, although I think this book is 100 years old, so I think the statute of limitations is passed. It turns out that Madeline has been buried alive. She comes back. Roderick sees her, screams, falls down. Madeline falls down. The narrator does not check anyone for a pulse, just runs out of the house, and then the house collapses. This is just not a person you want to depend on in a crisis. So I started writing a story with a narrator that I liked a lot more. And so this is the story of Alex Easton, who is a soldier from a completely made up country called Galatia that has been summoned. Madeline Usher wrote them, to say that she was dying. I'm misgendering my own protagonist. God, I could do that. Anyway, Alex is non-binary, and because of a peculiarity with the way that Galatia's language and pronouns work with their military. Basically, if they have a super complicated language with like 7 sets of pronouns, one of which is only used for God, and if you're a soldier, you get a different set of pronouns. So Alex is like, cool, let's go with that. Alex has just arrived at the House of Usher after a brief run-in with a British mycologist outside. There's fungus everywhere. It's probably not a spoiler because there's mushrooms all over the cover. Fungus plays an integral part. And has finally just arrived at the House of Usher. It took longer than I expected to reach the house. The landscape was one of those deceptive ones where you seem to be only a few hundred yards distant, but once you've picked your way through the hollows and wrinkles in the ground, you find it's taken a quarter of an hour to get where you're going. Ground like that saved my life multiple times in the war, but I'm still not fond of it. It always seems to be hiding things. In this case, it was hiding no more than a hare, which stared at Hob and me with huge orange eyes as we rode past. Hob ignored it. Hares are beneath his dignity. Reaching the house required crossing a short causeway over the lake, which Hob didn't enjoy any more than I did. I dismounted to lead him. The bridge looked sturdy enough, but the whole landscape was so generally decrepit that I found myself trying not to put my full weight down as I crossed, absurd as that sounds. Hob gave me the look he gives me when I'm asking him to do something that he considers excessive, but he followed. The clop of his hooves sounded curiously flat, as if muffled by wool. No one awaited me. The causeway led onto a shallow courtyard set back from the rest of the building. On either side, the walls dropped directly into the lake, with only the occasional balcony to break up the lines. The front door was positively Gothic, probably literally as well as figuratively, a great monstrosity set in a pointed archway that would have been at home on any cathedral in Prague. I took the great iron door knocker in hand and rapped on the door. The noise was so loud that I flinched back, half expecting the entire house to crumble at the vibration. There was no answer for many minutes. I began to feel uneasy. Surely Madeline could not have died in the time since her letter arrived. Was the household attending a funeral? Which only goes to show you how the damned place acted on my nerves. I would not normally jump to funeral as my first guess. Eventually, long after I'd given up hope and was eyeing the door knocker and wondering whether to make a second go of it, the door creaked open. An elderly servant peered around the door and stared at me. It was not an insolent stare so much as a puzzled one, as if I was not only unexpected, but completely outside his experience. "Hello," I said. "May I help you?" said the servant at the same time. We both paused, then I tried again. "I'm a friend of the usher's." The servant nodded gravely at this information. I waited, half expecting him to close the door again, but after a long, long moment, he finally said, "Would you like to come inside?" "Yes," I said, aware that I was lying. I did not want to go into that tired house dripping with fungus and architectural eyes, but Madeline had summoned me, and here I was. Yes, and architectural eyes, but Madeline had summoned me, and here I was. "Is someone available to tend my horse?" "If you will step inside, I will send the boy to attend to it." He opened the door, still not very wide. A shaft of gray daylight penetrated the darkness inside without illuminating much of anything. I walked down the shaft with my shadow taking point, and then the servant closed the door, and I stood in darkness. As leaden as the landscape outside had been, it was lit up like a burning city compared to the interior of the house. My eyes took a moment to adjust, and then there was a rasp of matches, and the servant lit a set of candles on the side table by the door. He handed me one as if it was completely normal for the house to be this dark at midday. "Easton?" The voice was familiar, though the owner stood in the shadows of the hallway. "Easton, what are you doing here?" I turned to face the owner of the voice just as he stepped forward. In the flickering light of the candle, I beheld my old friend Roderick Usher. He had been a friend of my youth and under my command in the war through an accident of fate. I knew his face as well as I knew my own, and I swear to you that if I had not heard his voice, I would not have recognized him. Roderick Usher's skin was the color of bone, white with a sallow undertone, a nasty color, like a man going into shock. His eyes had sunk into deep hollows tinged with blue, and if there was a spare grain of flesh left on his cheeks, I couldn't see it. The worst of it, though, was his hair. It floated in the air like spider silk, and I told myself it was a trick of the candlelight that made it look white rather than blonde. Either way, it was now all flyaway wisps, like strands of fog, drifting in a halo around his head. The very young and the very old have hair like that. It was unsettling to see it in a man a year my junior. Both Roderick and Madeline have always been rather pale, even when we were children. Later on, Roderick could be relied upon to burn rather than tan. They both had large liquid eyes, the sort that are called doe-like by poets, although those poets had mostly never hunted deer, because neither of the other ushers had giant elliptical pupils, and they both had perfectly serviceable whites. I could see rather too much of the whites of Roderick's eyes right now, in fact. His eyes gleamed feverishly in that unnaturally pale face. "Usher," I said, "you look like you've been dragged ass first through hell." He gave a choked laugh and clutched his head. "Easton," he said again, and when he lifted his head, there was a little more of the Roderick I knew in his expression. "Oh God, Easton, you have no idea." "You'll have to tell me," I said. I put an arm around his shoulders and thumped him, and there was no flesh on his bones at all. He'd always been raw-boned, but this was something else. I could feel individual ribs. If Hobb had ever looked like that, I'd challenge the stable master to pistols at dawn. "My God, Roderick, I don't think much of your cook if they let you go around looking like this." He sagged against me for a moment, then straightened and stepped back. "Why did you come?" "Maddie sent me a letter saying she was ill." I trailed off. I did not want to say that Maddie had written that Roderick thought she was dying. It was too bald a statement, and he looked like a shattered man. "She did?" His eyes showed even more white around the edges. "What did she say?" "Just that you were afraid for her health." When Roderick merely stared at me, I tried to make light of it. Also her lifelong unrequited passion for me, of course. So naturally, I came to sweep her off her feet and take her to live in my enormous castle in Galatia. "No," said Roderick, apparently ignoring my poor attempt at humor. "No, she can't leave here." "That was a joke, Roderick." I gestured with the candle. "I was worried, that was all. Do you want to keep standing in the hall? I've been on horseback all day." Anyway, there's a lot of descriptions of Oldring House that I'll skip over. They finally meet Madeline. She was swathed in gowns and blankets, so I could not see if she was as emaciated as Roderick, but her face had become so thin I could nearly see the bones under the skin. Her lips were tinged with violet like a drowning woman's. I told myself it was some poorly chosen cosmetic, and then she stretched out a hand like a bird's claw to me, and I saw her fingernails were the same deep cyanotic violet. "Maddie," I said, taking her hand. Thank God for the time they spent hammering manners into officers, because it was only reflex to let me bow over her wrist and say, in a reasonably normal tone of voice, "It's been so very long." "You haven't aged a day," she said. Her voice was weak, but still very much the Maddie I remembered. "You have grown more beautiful," I said. "And you have grown into an outrageous liar," she said, but she smiled as she said it, and a tiny bit of color came into her cheeks. I released her hand, and Roderick pointed me to the other person in the room, who I had barely noticed in my alarm. "May I present my friend, James Denton?" Denton was a tall, lanky man with silvering hair, probably approaching 50, if not quite over the edge. He wore his clothes as if they were clothes rather than symbols of rank, and his mustache was too long for fashion. "How do you do?" Denton said. "Ah, American." That explained the clothes and the way he stood with his legs wide and his elbows out, as if he had a great deal more space than was actually available. I'm never sure what to think of Americans. Their brashness can be charming, but just when I decide I rather like them, I meet one that I wish would go back to America and then perhaps keep going off the far edge into the sea. Let me just tell you, writing this book, getting to slag on Americans was the most fun I had. "Denton, this is my sister's friend, Lieutenant Easton, most recently of the 3rd Hussars." "A pleasure, sir," I said. I offered Denton my hand, because Americans will shake hands with the table if you don't stop them. He took it automatically, then stared at me, still holding my fingers, until I let them drop. I'll stop there, because I could just keep going at random. It's actually a very funny book, other than all the descriptions about people dying horribly, but I promise it's hilarious in between the horrible death and the horrible fungus and the horrible rabbits. I'm not saying this well. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
I was fascinated and delighted by this alternate route you took into Alex's non-binary identity via the military and the quirks of the language, as opposed to, you know, what I know best right here in the US. And I've been wondering how you came to that.
It was sort of convoluted. Authors, as I'm sure you and probably most of us here know, we have brains like pack rats, and if any interesting thing that comes along, we immediately steal and take back to our nest. And so I happened to be reading about a group in Albania who have the system was fascinating. The culture decreed women could not hold property, or they could not be the head of the household. And so the workaround for this, because they had very high mortality rates among young men, was that they just decided, okay, why don't we just make more men then? So even if you were born female, you could just swear, "I'm now a man," and everybody said, "Great, you can hold property now." And it was this just wonderfully human workaround to the problem. And it wasn't like, you know, they did not consider it a third gender or non-binary thing. You were a dude. That was just how it was. But what I found delightful is that you had like mothers who, if their husbands died and they were a widow, they would have to go live with his in-laws. And none of them wanted that for the most part. So they would be begging their daughters to swear to be sons so that they could hold the household, so that they didn't have to move in with their in-laws. And it was just this beautifully sort of human, quirky workaround to a cultural problem, and it was very different than, you know, the normal way we think about that people usually come to being not part of the usual binary. And so I just kind of, you know, stashed that sort of idea of workarounds in my pack rat brain, and it tied up with a lot of, you know, languages that I learned just enough in to realize that I was never going to master the language, which often had, you know, gendered pronouns or non-gendered pronouns. Or the one that got me was when I took Japanese in high school, and they had different words to count different types of objects, like flat things and round things, and people and animals all get different counting words. And I was like, it blew my mind as a teenager that you could just change the word for something like that, you know, like, so what with one thing and another, everything kind of percolated for a while, and I was like, okay, why don't we just have a culture where when you're a soldier, you get another set of pronouns as an honorific, and then somebody one day who perhaps was assigned female at birth walked in and said, I'm a soldier now, and they said, technically there's nothing in the regulations that says you can't be. Here's a gun, shave your head, get out there. Because, you know, I mean, it's set in 1890 something, so they had a lot of opportunities for the shave your head, take a gun, and get out there, I suspect. So yes, that's sort of where that came from, and the rest of it was just because it's remarkably fun to write, you know, sort of good-natured, maybe not the sharpest knife in the drawer, European military 1800s types. It was a lot of fun to be Easton when I was writing. And not just because I could insult Americans, and occasionally the British. Anything else? Yeah.
I just read The Seventh Bride.
Yes, I wrote that too, yes.
Yes, you did.
Yes,
Do you consider that a children's book or a young adult
Oh,
book?
okay, so awkward story. I only have one narrative voice, and so I sent that to the nice woman at Dial who published the Hamster Princess books, and she looked at it and she did not actually say, "You thought this was a children's book, did you?" But that sort of came across in the letter that was. I don't think that this is quite right for us. The voice is a little peculiar for the well, good luck with that. And my agent was like, I have no idea how to sell this book. I like it, but I can't sell it. And I was like, I will self-publish that book. And then it wound up getting like licensed or I don't know, whatever it calls when somebody buys it and republish it, reprint it, I don't know. I don't know if it's a children's book. I don't think it is, because my editor who actually edited the book left a lot of margin notes that said things like, and this was when you realized it wasn't a children's book, right? Okay, this was the bit where you realized it wasn't a children's book? How about now? So while the protagonist is young, and I think it could absolutely be YA or younger, and I probably would have loved it as a kid, there's some kind of weird stuff that goes on.
Very unsettling. It was a really good book.
Oh, thank you. Yay.